The other measures primarily relate to actions which the FSA is already focusing on, the idea that bonuses should be paid in long-term shares, not in cash, trying to prevent conflicts of interest which would arise with bonus payments to directors, payments in loss-making institutions. But at the moment, the FSA has a very limited range of sanctions. It can withdraw a banking license, which is the nuclear option, or it can impose a fine on the bank itself, which of course is then passed on. And we suggest that the way of holding the banks to account and protect the interests of their shareholders, whether they're private shareholders or public interest, is by ensuring that directors are fined, that they're directly responsible for the behaviour that takes place in their enterprises. The final point I want to make is this, that we also need to look beyond these specific measures to the underlying causes. Why do we get vast bonus payments within the banking system? One of the reasons is the very large profits that have been made in investment banking. At the moment, very large profits are being made in investment banking as a result of doing fairly simple things, buying and selling vast quantities of government bonds. And it's very clear that within that industry there is behaviour that has some of the characteristics of a cartel. I'm not saying it's a cartel in the formal sense, clearly it isn't, but it has some of those characteristics, as indeed is true of the magic circle of accountants and lawyers who stand behind that industry. And I raised a few weeks ago with the Office of Fair Trading whether they should investigate it. To my pleasant surprise, the Chief Executive of the Office of Fair Trade agreed that they should be looking at it, and he's confirmed to me in writing a couple of days ago that they are now starting to look at the fees that the investment banks earn in their advisory work as the first step in investigating where the very large come from, and hence the bonuses spin off from that. The other underlying reason why there's a problem in relation to the state-owned banks is that the emphasis this government has given is selling off these banks in a hurry. And I saw that Mr. Osborne yesterday committed the Conservatives to doing that. Completely wrong and wholly misguided. Because in order to sell off the banks in a hurry, the share price, of course, has got to be pumped up. And that brings with it all the bonus incentives surrounding the senior executives, particularly in RBS. The contrasting approach, which we've advocated for some time, I think was best summarised in evidence that was given to the Banking Commission by Sir Brian Pittman a few days before he died, in which he experienced the view of an experienced and sensible banker that what he aimed to do and what good bankers aim to do was to maximise shareholder value over something of the order of a decade, taking a long-term view. That's not what the currently semi-state-owned banks are trying to do. They're being prepared for a quick sell-off. Very dangerous, very foolish, not getting value for money, not enabling these banks to act in the wider national interest.
Thank you. Questions? Yep, Mike.
Mike Sargent, BBC News. It's fair to assume that after your attack on the banks, we'd have a much smaller banking sector at the end of it all. But banks contribute, by one estimate, about £100 billion to the UK economy. They generate a lot of jobs, a lot of revenue for the government. You say you want to build things rather than bet on things, but how are you going to replace that lost revenue? What concrete examples, what are we going to be building in this country to replace financial services?
Well, Mike, can I just say one rather sort of specific technical point? Because banks can offset corporation tax on losses, many of these banks won't be paying any meaningful form of corporation tax for many, many years. In fact, the 10% levy we're proposing will be, in effect, the only tax they pay at all because of their ability to offset against these monumental losses. So I think we just have to accept that the tax revenue coming from banks is going to be much, much lower for a considerable period of time. And in fact, only under our plans would we recoup some of it into the public purse. On the wider issue about reconfiguring the British economy and how you can particularly recycle savings from government spending into investment into particularly infrastructure, housing, transport, energy, which are job-rich activities now, but also are the infrastructure we require from the future. We'll provide more details of that in our manifesto tomorrow, but I don't know whether Vince wants to...
I mean, the process of making the banks safer, which is what we're talking about, may have the effect of making the banking system relatively smaller in relation to the rest of the British economy. And that's something that we fully acknowledge and almost certainly have to have. And the reason for that is that Britain is not in the same position as the other major Western countries. The share of bank balance sheets, whether you look at it in terms of assets or liabilities, as a share of British GDP, is much, much higher than in France or Germany or the United States. The dangers of systemic risk, the dangers of a banking collapse in the UK are much bigger. And that's why the action that needs to be taken in terms of breaking up banks, the Governor of the Bank of England's recommendation, is more urgent and important than it is in other Western countries. So we do have to act on these things.
The liabilities are now, I think I'm right in saying, 4.5 times, total liabilities of the British banking system are now 4.5 times the size of the whole British economy. That shows, that we're skating on thin ice as far as the threats, the long-term threats that those liabilities pose to the British economy.
Less than one in the United States.
Yep.
Rachel Younger, Sky News. Mr. Cable, on the Ask the Chancellor's debate, you spoke of your frustration with other European countries not acting quickly enough to reform their banking sectors. Isn't that because the reality of a free trade world means that these reforms simply can't work unless there's international agreement?
Well, it's desirable to have international agreement, but if, as Britain does, you have an exceptionally large banking sector, there are some things that are going to have to be done unilaterally. These actions we're proposing on bonuses can be taken at a UK level. The frustration I expressed is this, and we're getting into quite technical area, but in order to have the banks properly regulated, there has to be rules governing capital adequacy. Remember the old Basel formula? What is now being proposed are more complex rules, which relate to the size of institutions and their structure. It will take some years to get these properly agreed. But in the meantime, the British banks have got to be made safe, and that's why we've got to act on the advice of the Governor of the Bank of England in terms of the structure of the banks, why we've got to take actions to make sure that bonuses do not distort behaviour and create excessive risk, and we've got to do these at a UK level.